This is Chapter 5, 13 Years with IVS GB from 1971 to 1984. First part in London. When Edith and I returned from Zambia in 1971, we moved into a cottage we had bought in the little town of Holt in Norfolk. It was quite a sunny spring and the hedgerows were in flower. We enjoyed cycling along the country lanes and through quiet villages with their grey flintstone churches. It was very different from the Zambian bush. Our nearest neighbours seemed friendly. They said they were old colonials too, and that we must come in for sherry one day when we had settled down. After a few weeks we thought we had settled down, but we never got the sherry. Holt was not a good location for finding a permanent job, but we did both find temporary work during the summer at a school of English. It was a very bad school. We were lodged at a university hostel in Norwich. The students consisted of young Italians out for a fun holiday, and they got no fun from the tinned spaghetti and other delights of British cuisine which they were offered, and a few serious Germans, and some Arabs from the Gulf who thought they knew English already. The school was based in a handsome mansion in the town of Aylsham, run by a very obese man. He had assembled a bizarre collection of teachers, which included a young man called Philby, who was related to the famous spy, and us. After this episode, I was happy to find a job back with International Voluntary Service, as London Field Officer. IVSP had dropped the word peace from its title in deference to English charity law, which deemed peace to be political. Charity law has since changed. Volunteer Action for Peace, where I'm currently active, is a registered charity. IVS was and is the British branch of Service Civil International. At that time, IVS had local groups all over the UK which did useful social support work, such as helping elderly people with decorating their homes, digging their gardens, supporting people with disabilities, or running activities for children. I was responsible for supporting and promoting the 20 such groups in London. For this task I was given the use of a car, a mixed blessing, as our temporary home was a bed-sit in Kensington where I had to get up early to feed the parking meter. I was pleased that one of my first tasks was to accompany 2 African volunteers on their visits to local projects. Sam Ade Oyewole was from Voluntary Work Camps Association of Nigeria, and Paul Dame from Volugana. They'd been invited to Britain as part of the exchange scheme. My most bizarre memory of them is of a visit to the Lewisham branch of IVS, where the main activity week after week was stuffing teddy bears for a children's project at Christmas. Sam and Paul looked on with disbelief at this peculiar activity, not a winning idea for Nigeria or Ghana. The London regional office was a kind of tenement in Macklin Street near Covent Garden. With my assistant, Mary Ann Acton, I occupied an attic room. Downstairs was the office of the Child Poverty Action Group, the director of which was Frank Field, who was to become a well-known politician. I would frequently pass Lord Longford, their chairman, on the stairs. We settled into a tiny new terrace house in Bermondsey, very near the River Thames. A few weeks after moving in, a notice was delivered warning residents to move upstairs in case of flooding. The river wall was soon to be raised and the Thames barrier would be built. Bermondsey has not been flooded yet. Edith started teaching at a nearby secondary school and we decided to adopt a child. Tom was born in 1973 and this changed our lives. We adopted Sally after we'd moved to Leicester. She was born in 1977. We had a very happy family life, although I rather regret spending too much time away from the family on field visits for IVS and later working in Paris or in Burundi. Next section, Overseas Service Officer. 4 months of work with voluntary groups in London was quite a good way of catching up with the changes that had occurred during my 10 years away in Zambia. I remember the secretary of the Brixton IVS group taking me for a walk, listening to the fairly new sound of reggae. However, I was happy to get back into more contact with Africa when I was appointed Overseas Service Officer in 1972, administering IVS's programme of volunteer development workers. The British Volunteer Programme, as explained above, of which we were a part, was really just a budget from the then Ministry of Overseas Development, which supported agencies which recruited skilled British volunteers to work in so-called developing countries, normally for a period of 2 years or more. The other agencies were VSO, the largest and best known, the United Nations Association International Service, the National Union of Students, briefly, and the Catholic Institute for International Relations, which later was called Progressio. The BVP committee allocated countries to these agencies, IVS worked in Botswana, Lesotho, Swaziland, Mauritius, Seychelles, Cameroon, and later the Comoro Islands and Mozambique, with a few projects in South Asia. IVS was the most volunteerish of the agencies and wanted to recruit people who would be real volunteers rather than technical assistance personnel. So, as part of their preparation, we insisted that they took part in an international work camp in Britain before joining the regular orientation course. We hoped this would give them an idea of the other aspects of the work of IVS. It sometimes led to a volunteer deciding to work nearer home rather than overseas, or falling in love with one of the other work campers. The greater part of our overseas program was in southern Africa, in Botswana, Lesotho and Swaziland. We argued that supporting these newly independent High Commission territories was a way of showing alternatives to the segregation in South Africa and of promoting eventual reconciliation. The volunteers we recruited tended to be either straight from university or young professionals. Part of my job was to give recruitment talks at colleges and careers fairs around the country. There were no websites or Google in those days. We invited applicant volunteers to attend a selection weekend in a rural hideaway, most often at a freezing cold place in the beautiful woodland near Haslemere in Surrey. A mixture of interviews and social activities usually gave us a good idea of how the candidates would fit into a new culture, and if not, we hoped they would learn enough to deselect themselves. They had also to undergo a personality test, usually administered by a rather dry psychologist. This process was not always successful. Once we managed to send a motor mechanic to India without discovering that he was allergic to oil. On another occasion, a woman who sailed through the personality test turned out to be highly neurotic. Our psychologist's excuse was that she was a smiling depressive, and the system could not cope with that. The final stage before the volunteers departed was an orientation course lasting several days, which included talks by former volunteers and by nationals of the countries to which the volunteers were going, plus an introduction to the language and practical information on matters like travel and health. For several years, this took place in the palatial Stoke Rochford Hall near Grantham in Lincolnshire. We always tried to invite nationals of the countries to which the volunteers were to serve, and they taught the local languages. I have always insisted that at least some basic knowledge of the language is vital for good relations, and it was good to hear the sounds of Setswana, Sesotho, Siswati and Pidgin English echoing through the building. These orientation courses were enjoyed by all, and they created a relationship between the volunteers and the staff in the UK, which was valuable once the volunteers were serving overseas. In later years, we were sometimes able to organise a further orientation and language course after the volunteers had arrived in their country. When I started, IVS's programme was run exclusively from London. One of us would undertake a rapid field visit each year to select requests for volunteers from governments or other agencies and to support and check up on the serving volunteers. To deal with any problems that would arise in the country and to follow up contacts made on the field visits, we always asked one of the serving volunteers to act as a coordinator. This was difficult as the person chosen also had a full-time job. At that time, VSO used to use the services of the British Council for this role. CIIR had already pioneered the idea of a field officer, appointing Julian Filakovsky in Central America. Later he became the head of the Catholic agency CAFOD. In 1973, we managed to obtain funding from the Overseas Development Ministry for Tom Franklin to work as a field officer in Cameroon, and for Lois Carter to cover Botswana, Lesotho and Swaziland. Later we were able to fund separate offices in each country, including the Comoro Islands and Mozambique. IVS was a pioneer in appointing nationals of the country as field officers. Next heading is Swaziland. The country is now called Eswatini. My first field visits to IVS overseas programs were in 1973 and 1974, and the first country I arrived in was Swaziland. It was warm, green, and very beautiful. During this time of apartheid, tourists came to Swaziland to do what was forbidden in South Africa: buy books by politically minded black authors, or more often Playboy, or to gamble at the casino and break the colour bar, which included bathing in the nude in the warm springs nicknamed the Cuddle Puddle. On Friday evenings, the dramatic road which winds down from the tiny capital city, Mbabane, to the second city, Manzini, was lined with Swazi girls waiting to be picked up. The country had attracted investment in hotels, mining and sugar plantations, but most of the profits left the country. And the Swazis who benefited most were members of the enormous royal family. There's a footnote here. One day a minibus full of princesses overturned, and it did not even get a headline in the local paper. Political repression had already begun. In 1973, only 5 years after independence, the aged King Sobhuza II suspended the constitution. Political parties were banned in 1978, and repression continues to this day. However, the volunteers from IVS did play a positive role in Swaziland's development, as there was a serious lack of trained personnel, as in most post-colonial states. The government officials were good to work with, and it was easy visiting the government ministries as they were all close together above the shops in Mbaban's main street. The IVS volunteers were working in agricultural research, industrial development, and health. But the majority were teachers in an education system which was somewhat dysfunctional. Many secondary schools squeezed as many as 60 children into a small classroom, and the curriculum was too academic to be helpful to the majority. However, working and living in small rural schools, the volunteer teachers were probably the best integrated into the local community. One school I visited where we did not have volunteers was Waterford Kamhlaba, now one of the United World Colleges, and at the time a famous multiracial boarding school where prosperous blacks and liberal whites from all over southern Africa sent their children as a way of confronting and avoiding apartheid. All this was before the advent of AIDS, which has hit southern Africa harder than anywhere. One project we supported in Swaziland was an orphanage for coloured children. Swazis explained that any black orphans would always be cared for by their extended family. But in recent years, AIDS has produced more orphans than the traditional system can bear. The next country is Lesotho. I went by road from Swaziland to Lesotho in 1973, 7 hours through the wide open spaces of what was then the Transvaal, and over the Caledon River straight into Maseru, which was still the tiny, slightly shabby colonial capital it had been until independence in 1966. The only intrusion from the modern world was the Holiday Inn, with its ugly flashing sign advertising the casino, where, along with South African tourists, numerous poorly paid Basotho gambled away their wages. Lesotho's beauty is very different from that of Swaziland. The mountains are higher, drier and rougher, often flat-topped or with a krantz, a big rock on top. The soil erosion is dramatic. The rains have cut deep mini-canyons known as dongas. Thousands of tons of soil are washed away by the Senku River. This river is known in South Africa as the Orange, which is the colour of its water due to the mass of soil it's carrying. As a way of controlling erosion, there's a National Tree Planting Day, but the trees often face a losing battle against hungry goats. With mission schools dating from the mid-19th century, Lesotho had produced more educated citizens than Swaziland or Botswana, but many of these were working in South Africa, and so here also there was a lack of people with skills and qualifications. As in Swaziland, the largest number of IVS volunteers were school teachers, mainly of maths and science, but some worked in agriculture, at the university, in the remote hospital at Parai, high on the plateau, and in the flying doctor service, which was often able to use a Land Rover instead of a plane as the mountain roads improved. Volunteers were requested for many types of job. An interesting one was from King Moshweshwe II for someone to work in his garden. I was invited for tea and biscuits in his little palace, the former resident commissioner's house, but I had to explain politely that we had development priorities and the royal garden was not really one of them. On my second visit to Lesotho, the very friendly British High Commissioner gave me a lift in his Range Rover from Bloemfontein Airport. I was amused when we stopped exactly halfway across the bridge which forms the frontier with South Africa, and the driver got out and raised the Union Jack on the front bonnet. I was invited to stay the night and I enjoyed a cup of early morning tea with the royal monogram on it. The next night in a village near Butabute, with a corrugated shack for a toilet, was quite a contrast. The political temperature in Lesotho had been high since the 1970 elections, which the more radical Basotho Land Congress Party had won, but had been denied office in a coup by the governing Basotho National Party led by Leabua Jonathan. In 1974, after an attempted uprising, Sumokhetle and other BCP leaders fled the country, and the police mobile unit was very active. To add to this, unemployment had risen fast, as many migrant workers had returned to Lesotho after troubles at Welkom mine in South Africa. The king had returned from exile, but had little influence. Odilon Seheri worked in the Ministry of Education and was close to the king. I had known him at the Institute of Education in London back in 1961, and I visited him in Lesotho. I was shocked to learn in 1981 that his body had been found by a rural road. He and others were clearly victims of the police mobile unit. I returned to Lesotho in 1993 when CCIVS organised a training seminar. Next one is Botswana. My train journey through the impoverished Bechuanaland Protectorate on my way to Northern Rhodesia in 1961 is described above. The independent Botswana where I arrived on my field visit in 1973 was a very different place. The capital had moved from Mafeking in South Africa, formerly Mafeking, where the siege was famously relieved during the Boer War in 1900, to a brand new capital, Gaborone, planned like another African version of Milton Keynes. I saw signs that the country's economic development was about to take off, with the development of the copper and nickel mining town of Selebi Pikwe, though the biggest resource, diamonds, was still in the future. Independent Botswana was an easy place for foreign NGOs, too easy perhaps. The small population and lack of well-educated personnel meant that expatriates of all kinds, including IVS volunteers, were badly needed, and the administration was welcoming and efficient. Tswana tradition is fairly democratic. The people lived in large settlements, more like towns than villages, such as Sirue, Kanye, Malipolole and Mochudi, each of which had its kotla, a court or council where all the men participated. Cattle are central to Tswana culture, and young men traditionally looked after the animals, which meant spending time at cattle posts far from the villages. Girls are therefore often better educated than boys, and thus women play a more important role in Botswana than in most African countries. In spite of political freedom and relatively low level of corruption, the ruling Botswana Democratic Party has always remained dominant, and the various opposition parties only strong in their own local areas. Surviving on the edge of the Kalahari Desert, rain is important. The national currency is the pula, which means rain. I remember how Sitwe Chiepe, the Botswana High Commissioner, arriving at the Independence Party at the Commonwealth Institute in London in a heavy rainstorm and explaining that this meant that the day had been blessed. One bad aspect of Botswana has been its treatment of the minority Basarwa, or Bushmen, who live in the Kalahari Desert. Patrick van Rensburg, as a very young man, had served as the South African vice-consul in the Belgian Congo, but he resigned in protest at the racial injustice in South Africa. He came to London and was involved in the beginnings of the anti-apartheid movement in London, and his main work, in fact, was then in Botswana, where he founded the progressive Swaneng Hill School at Siroi, and later also Shashe River and Madiba schools. He also created the brigades. These were an imaginative type of technical training program geared to the production of goods or services, carpentry, motor mechanics, dressmaking, where young men and women learned trades along with school subjects with a practical slant. These projects were coordinated by the Foundation for Education with Production, which Patrick founded in Botswana and which is now active in South Africa and elsewhere. He was a very practical man who inspired those who worked with him and the many students who benefited from his work. I think I only met him once, but his dream fitted well with IVS's ideas of development, and our volunteers played an important part at these schools and brigades.